Okay, so let me start with a single sentence. One sentence said publicly on the record this week by the United States Treasury Secretary, the person whose entire job is to manage the American economy. Here is the sentence. 50 days of higher prices for 50 years of no Iranian nuclear capability. Now I want you to hold that sentence in your mind for a moment, because it is doing something that almost no official statement in this entire situation has done. It is telling ordinary Americans explicitly with specific numbers what they are being asked to pay and what they are being promised in return. 50 days of higher energy prices. That is the cost. 50 years of no Iranian nuclear capability. That is the promise. Most people will hear that and think, okay, that is a reasonable trade. 50 days of discomfort for 50 years of safety. That sounds manageable. But here is the thing that changes everything about how you understand that sentence. The outcome being promised in return for 50 days of economic pain, the elimination of Iran's nuclear program, was offered by Iran itself voluntarily at a negotiating table in Geneva before any of this started, without any days of higher prices, without any cost to ordinary people anywhere in the world, on the table, ready to be agreed to. So the question is not whether the price tag is worth paying. The question is why there is a price tag at all. And answering that question honestly, following the evidence, tracing the incentives, looking at what was known and when, is what this video is about today. Let me explain why that single sentence from Scott Bessent is one of the most revealing things any American official has said during this entire situation. Not because of what it says directly, but because of what it confirms without meaning to. When a Treasury Secretary goes on record with a specific cost-benefit frame, 50 days of pain for 50 years of safety, it tells you several things simultaneously that you would not learn from any press conference or official briefing. The first thing it tells you is that the economic cost has become large enough that it needs to be publicly defended. Treasury secretaries do not make statements like this when everything is going smoothly. They do not go on record with specific timeframes and specific promises when the public is satisfied and patient. They make statements like this when the pain is visible enough, widespread enough, and politically damaging enough that staying silent about it is no longer an option. The fact that Bessent felt the need to put a number on it tells you that the number has been noticed by enough ordinary Americans, in enough fuel stations and energy bills and grocery receipts, that the administration can no longer afford to leave it unaddressed. The second thing it tells you is that the nuclear program is still the official justification. Even after the person who ran America's National Security Assessment Center confirmed publicly that all 18 intelligence agencies agreed Iran had no capacity to produce one, even after a senior diplomat confirmed that Iran offered to surrender the entire program in Geneva before any of this started, the nuclear justification is still the frame being used to sell the cost to the public. And the third thing, the most important, is that the administration has shifted from promising a quick victory to managing expectations about pain. 50 days of higher prices is not a victory statement. It is a pain management statement. It is the language of a government that can no longer say this will be quick and painless, and is now saying instead, yes, there is pain. Here is how long we think it lasts. Here is what we are promising in return. That shift, from promising a fast, decisive outcome to managing the public's tolerance for economic discomfort, is one of the clearest signals available about where the situation actually stands right now. Now, here is the piece that makes Bessent's sentence not just revealing, but genuinely extraordinary. And to understand why, I need to take you back to something we covered in an earlier video on this channel. Iran went to Geneva, Switzerland. Active negotiations were taking place between Iranian officials and representatives from several countries. The British National Security Advisor, not an Iranian source, but the British government's own senior security official, later confirmed that meaningful progress was being made. During those talks, Iran put a specific offer on the table. It offered to give up all of its enriched uranium, the entire nuclear program. The capability that American and Israeli officials had been pointing to for years as the central reason Iran was considered dangerous. The British described the offer as credible. Hours later, the current situation began. So the 50 days of higher prices that Bessent is asking ordinary Americans to accept is the cost of achieving something that was already available at no cost, something that was sitting on a table in Geneva, something that a neutral third party confirmed was a genuine offer. Let me put this in the simplest possible terms because I think an analogy makes it clearest. Imagine you want your neighbor to cut down a tree that is leaning over your fence. You are worried about it. Your neighbor comes to you and says, "I will cut it down right now for free. I just need a small written agreement about where the wood goes afterward." You think about it. And instead of taking the free offer, you hire an extremely expensive specialist tree removal company. The process takes weeks. It damages your fence, it disrupts your street, and then your financial advisor comes out and tells your neighbors, yes, this is expensive, and yes, it is causing disruption, but think about 50 years without that tree hanging over the fence. The price tag exists because the free option was not taken. And the question that Besant's sentence forces into the open, without him meaning it to, is why the free option was not taken. What was the system responding to when it chose the expensive and disruptive path over the one that was already on the table? That question is the most important one available right now, and we have been building toward the answer across every video on this channel. Here's what I want to ask you before we continue. Besant said 50 days of higher prices for 50 years of no Iranian nuclear capability, but Iran already offered to give up its nuclear program for free in Geneva before this started. Did you know about the Geneva offer? And does knowing about it change how you see the price tag? Tell me in the comments. Because I think the gap between these two facts is the most important thing to understand about how this situation began. Now let me look at the price tag more carefully. Because 50 days of higher energy prices sounds specific and manageable when a Treasury secretary says it cleanly in one sentence. But the actual cost accumulating right now is considerably more complex and considerably larger than 50 days of discomfort. Start with the energy situation. The International Energy Agency, the most credible neutral energy authority on Earth, the organization whose entire purpose is to monitor and assess the global energy system, has stated publicly that this situation is worse than both of the major energy crises of the 1970s combined. Not one of them, both of them together. Let me put those crises in context for anyone who was not alive during them. The 1973 crisis, triggered by an oil embargo, produced a severe recession across the Western world. Long lines at fuel stations, rationing, economic contraction that lasted years. The 1979 crisis, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, produced another recession. More economic disruption, more years of recovery. These were not 50-day events. They were multi-year structural disruptions to the global economy. The International Energy Agency is saying the current situation is worse than both of those combined. That is not 50 days of higher prices. That is a structural disruption to the global energy system that takes considerably longer than 50 days to resolve, even if everything stopped right now, today, completely. Then there is the Strait of Hormuz situation that we covered in depth in earlier videos. Iran has transformed the world's most important energy choke point into a selective system where passage depends on which country you are from and whether you are willing to pay in Chinese yuan rather than American dollars. Every country that pays in yuan to get its oil through establishes a precedent. Every transaction processed outside the dollar-denominated system makes the next such transaction more normal. The damage to the dollar's global position, the structural long-term cost that does not appear in any 50-day price tag, is accumulating with every ship that passes through paying in yuan. And then there is something from today's feed that most people are not connecting to the price tag at all. Iran has publicly stated it is considering cutting the undersea cables that carry approximately 95% of the world's internet traffic. Not oil, not energy. The physical communication infrastructure that the entire global digital economy depends on, financial systems, supply chains, healthcare coordination. Everything that runs online, which is now almost everything, travels through physical cables on ocean floors. And a significant number of those cables pass through or near areas where Iran has influence. 50 days of higher fuel prices does not begin to describe what disrupting those cables would mean. Besant's price tag captures the visible, immediate, measurable cost that ordinary Americans feel when they fill their tank. It does not capture the structural, long-term, systemic costs that are being accumulated right now across energy markets, financial systems, and global communication infrastructure. Now here is the structural question that this video has been building toward. Why does the price keep growing? Why does each week add new dimensions of cost that were not in the original calculation? And who made the choices that set that growth in motion? The answer connects to something we have traced across multiple videos on this channel. The decision to begin this situation was based on an assumption. The assumption was that the rapid application of overwhelming pressure would produce a quick and decisive change in Iran's behavior, that the system would absorb the initial shock and collapse or capitulate within a short time. That assumption was built on a specific model of how conflicts work. The model says, hit hard enough, fast enough, and the other side loses its ability to function. The command structure collapses, the government loses legitimacy, the population turns, and the whole thing is over before the economic cost becomes a political problem at home. We covered this model in the shock and awe video, and we covered why Iran specifically was designed to defeat it. Decentralized command, pre-planned responses at every level. Underground infrastructure, a network of relationships across the region that continues operating independently even when the center is disrupted. Iran spent decades building a system that would keep functioning exactly when this model predicted it would collapse. Every week, the assumed quick outcome does not arrive. The original calculation falls further behind reality. And every week, it falls behind reality. The justification for continuing requires fresh framing to maintain public support. Besant's 50-day price tag is that fresh framing. It is the administration adapting its public communication to a situation that has not resolved on the timeline the original decision assumed. And the people who pay the price for that gap between what was assumed and what actually happened are not the people who made the original decision. They are the ordinary families in America, in the Gulf states, in Europe, in India, in every country connected to the global energy system, who had no seat at any of the tables where those assumptions were made and that decision was taken. Here is what I want to know from you. Besant said 50 days. But the International Energy Agency said this is worse than both 1970s crises combined, and those lasted years. Do you think 50 days is an accurate estimate of the real price? Or do you think the actual cost is something much larger and much longer? Tell me in the comments. So here is what Scott Besant's sentence actually reveals. It reveals that the domestic economic cost of this situation has become visible and painful enough that the Treasury Secretary of the United States felt the need to go on record with a specific cost-benefit justification for ordinary Americans. It reveals that the nuclear program, which Iran offered to surrender in Geneva before any of this started, which the person who ran America's National Security Assessment Center confirmed all 18 intelligence agencies said Iran had no capacity to build, is still the official frame being used to justify that cost to the public. It reveals that the administration has moved from promising a quick, decisive outcome to managing the public's tolerance for economic pain. And that shift is one of the clearest signals available about where the situation actually stands. And it reveals something this channel has been tracing from the very beginning. The price tag that gets stated officially, 50 days of higher prices, and the actual cost being accumulated across energy systems, financial systems, the dollar's global position, and the structural foundations of the global economy is a gap that ordinary people will be living inside long after the 50 days Besant described are over. The Geneva offer was available at no cost. The price tag Besant described is what choosing not to take that offer has cost so far, and the meter is still running. Last question. If you could go back to the moment before Geneva, knowing what you know now about the price tag, knowing that Iran's offer to surrender its entire nuclear program was sitting on the table, what decision do you think should have been made? Tell me in the comments. Because I think the answer most people give privately is different from the answer the official narrative has assumed all along.